I'm delighted to have been invited to take part in this symposium today. And my name's Gita Ramdharry. I work at the Queen Square Centre for Neuromuscular Diseases at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in central London. And I've been working for many years with people with inherited neuropathy. Just to go into the different inherited neuropathies, they're also known as Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease after the people who first discovered them. And we know that these conditions, there are now, as I found out last week, approximately 120 genes that can cause Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. And those genes can affect any part of the nerve structure or function. So, for example, there are demyelinating CMT types, or CMT type 1, where the myelin sheath, so particular proteins in the myelin sheath, are implicated. And the most common type of CMT, which is 1A, is where the peripheral myelin protein 22 gene is affected. And there are also axonal types of CMT, or CMT type 2, and there they sometimes can be genes that are involved with proteins for axonal transport. And there are also X-linked types and for gap junction proteins, etc. And so not only can CMT be broken up into the different types of part of the nerve that's affected, but also the inheritance type with autosomal dominant types, recessive types, which are the CMT4s, and as mentioned, X-linked CMT. So as a group, they tend to be length dependent. So they tend to involve the peripheries first, the feet and the hands, and are most commonly sensory motor, but there are some sensory predominant and motor predominant variants that come under the CMT umbrella. And the different types can sometimes come on in different stages of life. So, for example, CMT1A comes on in the first decade of life, so people have it from childhood, whereas some of the type 2 CMTs can come on in the fifth or sixth decade. But what is common with all of them is there is a slow progression of the disease. So just going now into the key impairments. So weakness is one of the key impairments, but we can boil that down into looking at weakness in different ways. So there's the primary muscle weakness, which is where there's direct denervation of the muscle fibre, and that muscle fibre then will waste away and will turn to fat. And so this atrophy that we see is a real cardinal sign of neuropathy, and we can see in the hands here marked atrophy and also the distal atrophy here with this person. But then we know that there's probably, and we've got some evidence for this, secondary muscle weakness, where some of the less affected muscles become weaker through disuse, and I'll show you some evidence for that in a moment. And another consequence of weakness, where there's an imbalance between weak muscles and strong muscles, is joint deformity. And we can see the cavus foot here, which is a classic deformity that we see with CMT. We can see the claw hand, and this is a very severe foot deformity. This is after the person had surgery. So the MRI work in CMT has been very helpful to understand what's happening structurally. This was one of the first papers. So on the left here, we've got sections through the foot of the normal person with these dark, plump muscles here that we can see in the intrinsic foot muscles. In the middle, we've got somebody with moderate CMT, and we can see there's some fatty streaking, and this fat is the atrophy. As soon as we start to get the primary weakness, there's the fatty infiltration. But we can still see some contractile tissue in there. And then on the right, we've got somebody with much more severe CMT. So there's hardly any muscle left. It's all pretty much fat. And you can see that arch of the foot has come up as well. And then if we're looking at this idea of secondary disuse or secondary weakness, this is a colleague of mine at Queen Square. So this is the thigh of a healthy person and the shank of a healthy person. And we can see here with the person with CMT1A at the bottom, we can see the fatty infiltration, as you'd expect, because it tends to affect the periphery more. And at the top, the thigh muscle here, so the quads and the hamstrings, show much less fatty infiltration. So they're less affected, which is what we see. But look at the change in volume. So there's volume loss. And that is secondary, so that is probably down to disuse. And actually, when we use the dynamometer to look at strength, what this team found was that there was about 80% of predicted normal strength in the quadriceps and the hamstrings. We also see evidence of deconditioning from a cardiorespiratory perspective as well. So we did an exercise trial, and our baseline data showed that here there is a reduction in the predicted maximum VO2, so the oxygen uptake. So people were only hitting at about 80% of what we would expect for their age, gender, etc. And then when we looked at the heart rate data, they weren't actually reaching their maximum heart rate. So something's stopping them. But there is also an element of deconditioning, we think. And why might that be? So we also, a few years ago, did a study of activity monitoring, and with matched controls. This is 20 people with CMT and 20 healthy matched controls. And they were doing at about 11,500 steps per day over a 7-day period, whereas the people with CMT were only doing about 6,500. So that could be one reason why we're seeing this deconditioning. And another symptom that's very prevalent and problematic is fatigue. So colleagues in the Netherlands found that 70% of people with CMT report severe fatigue. And we did some focus group work just to try and get a feel of what it was like. And what was so striking is some of the descriptions. It's very much like the body's packing up, letting people down. People described a tidal wave. It was very similar to some of the descriptions you hear from people with MS or Parkinson's disease related fatigue as well. But it's certainly impactful. And this participant talks about how it impacted on their role as a parent and then being able to do things at home. This could be fatigue because of living with a chronic condition like we see in other diseases, but also we know that people with CMT are more likely to have obstructive sleep apnea and restless legs, which could be interrupting sleep. Pain is also a very common symptom. And you've seen the joint deformity. So yes, there's musculoskeletal pain due to joint deformity around the ankles, under the metatarsals, for example. Knee pain is very common, as we're just looking at the moment. But also where there's the more axonal types of CMT, the CMT2, where the small fibres are more involved, there's a greater prevalence of neuropathic pain, which is often described as burning, shooting, electric shock type pain, is much more random. However, it used to be thought that people with CMT1A didn't get neuropathic pain, but my colleagues at Queen Square have found that actually that's not the case, because some of the pain fibres, the A delta fibres, are thinly myelinated. So you can sometimes hear descriptions of neuropathic pain from people with demyelinating CMT as well. So now taking some of those symptoms and signs into activity limitations. So with gait, this is some gait data that we collected in our gait lab some years ago. So here we can see with the ankle, this is in the swing phase here, you can see the foot drop that you get, and you can see this on the video. And also in stance phase, at the end of stance phase, just before pre-swing, the control of the tibia and the ankle position isn't so good, and people tend to collapse into dorsiflexion. And if we look down at the ankle moment and the power generation, we see a reduction in the plantar flexor moment. So that is why they can't control it. And then here we can see in the bottom graph an increase in hip flexion in swing phase. So this is the steppage gait, and you can certainly see that on this gentleman here, or marionette gait as it used to be found. So there's a few studies now that have looked at gait and actually found these key elements. And more recently, our colleagues in Italy have been doing some work looking at stepping upstairs and downstairs. And these are some of the kinematic data graphs showing the differences when people in the ankle angle, when people are actually ascending stairs and descending stairs. And again, that lack of plantar flexor control is key in both directions. So we're also very interested in balance and falls. And we did a survey of 107 people with CMT, and more than a third of them fall at least once a month, and some very frequently. In a follow-up study of 32 people with CMT, we asked them to send cards to us each time they fell, and we tracked them over 6 months. And within the first 4 weeks, the first month, 20 of them had already fallen. I mean, there are actually 4 people who didn't fall at all, but we can see that falling is a really common experience for people with CMT. And so we wanted to explore more about that. And so we've done some work in the lab as well, looking at static balance and posturography. And this is some of the early static data. So we find that if you close the eyes, so if you affect vision or you reduce the base of support, then you get an increase in the mean velocity of the center of pressure. And then looking at that a little bit more closely, we calculated a Romberg quotient so we could see the effect of vision. And people with CMT are visually dependent because of the sensory impairment. And that actually had much more of an effect on their balance than changing the stance width. And our colleagues in Italy, Antonio Nardoni and his team, have looked at reactive balance, where they stood people on a rotating platform and they did a toe-up rotation of 3 degrees, a fast rotation. And what they found in people with CMT1A, that there was an absence of a short latency reflex and a delay in the medium latency reflex. Now, with people with CMT1A, this is a demyelinating neuropathy. So our 1A afferents are thickly myelinated, fast conducting afferents, which you would expect to be stimulated with this sort of action. And because they are absent or certainly damaged in people with CMT1A, that's why you don't have a short latency reflex at all. And then, but with some of the smaller neurons, then they will pick up and activate a little bit later on, but certainly delayed. And then looking at hand function, this has had much less attention than gait and balance. And our colleagues in the Netherlands found that hand function can be affected by a number of things: weakness, sensation, fatigability of the muscles, and there's changes in grip patterns. But certainly weakness seemed to be the main predictor of dexterity performance. And they found that that having these problems can impact on fine motor tasks and certainly activities of daily living and quality of life. So now just looking at rehabilitation interventions. So there's a few questions in terms of exercise interventions, and that's what's mainly been done so far. So can exercise improve primary weakness? Well, our colleagues in Australia did a study in children with CMT1A called the FAST trial, where the intervention group did 6 months of progressive resistance training. But what's interesting and important here is that they only selected children who had above a grade 4 MRC in the dorsiflexor muscles. And this was their results graph. So the children that didn't do the training carried on with a slow progression around the same rate as the natural history that you'd expect. With the children who did do the strength training, there was a slight delay, but there was an improvement in strength, and that was sustained over 2 years. They also did MRI, this group, and they didn't see any problems with the strength training. So there was no increase in fatty infiltration or indicators of harm. But what they didn't show was an increase in volume. So the question there then is these increases in strength actually due to central neural changes and an increase in central activation rather than something happening in the periphery. And actually where most of the exercise research has been done is actually in disuse weakness, or the secondary weakness in the proximal muscles. And there's been a few studies, but this is the seminal study from 1995, which was a randomized controlled trial where they did quite high intensity resistance training and found improvements in isokinetic torque and also walking speed. And a few years ago, we did a study of hip flexor training, and we did that because of the compensatory use of the hip flexors during walking, and we found a 20% increase in hip flexor strength, but it didn't carry over into gait, and we were probably underpowered for the measures we were using. But what we did find is that the people who were weaker to start with made the biggest gains, and that for us was quite an important lesson for conducting exercise trials. And we also, a few years ago, did one where we looked at the aerobic capacity question, showing you the data earlier. And here we did a crossover trial of 28 people with CMT. They did 12 weeks exercise bike training, 80% of max heart rate for 3 times a week. And we found there was an 11% improvement in that VO2 peak after the training compared to the control period. And then we're also very interested in how we train balance, how we use exercise for that. So we're just writing up a paper where we did a pilot feasibility study of home-based balance training to be delivered in the community of proprioceptive training, so using foam and eyes open, eyes closed and different movements, but also proximal strength training. And we did that for 12 weeks. And because this was a feasibility study, we looked at the effect sizes, and for the functional balance measures, we got very promising and very good effect sizes. And on our lab-based centre of pressure variables showed moderate effect sizes. So we would like to explore taking this further into a larger trial. And then, but what is interesting, that was very much focused on balance, but two studies by colleagues in Italy and then this study in Denmark looked at treadmill training. The second one was using one of the AlterG treadmills. And with both of these studies, they were looking at the exercise element of treadmill training, but didn't really necessarily get a big change in the 6-minute walk. But both of them had improvements in the balance variables, so the Berg balance. And this graph is from the Denmark study, where we can see improvements with after the training in the Berg balance and also the postural stability test. And I do wonder if the treadmill is actually some sort of perturbation training for these people, and that's why they're seeing these improvements. And then just very quickly, this has only been one study looking at hand rehabilitation in CMT. There's, as I mentioned, there needs to be a lot more work done in this. And this study from our colleagues in Genoa in Italy looked at 9 people with CMT. They did 4 weeks of training twice a week for 45 minutes with a physiotherapist, looking at strength training. They looked at specific movements, stretching, and then proprioceptive training with different objects. And what they found, interestingly, was some improvements in the tripod pinch on the right and the left hands, and an improvement in one of the functional measures. But this is a small study, obviously, and needs to be looked at in a bigger group. So moving now on to orthoses, which is another very important element of management for people with CMT. So we would often give people foot orthoses. These are good if people have foot pain, they're unstable, or their alignment of their feet and ankles is poor. But often what I will do is I will go in, I will feel if they do have a joint deformity, is it manually correctable? Because that will then indicate that we might be able to do something quite useful with orthoses. If it's fixed, we might then be talking to the surgeons. And so we want to try and redistribute pressure under the foot, particularly if people get a lot of pain under the metatarsals. You can put a bar like this behind them to take the weight off. And to increase stability, if people have a very cavous foot and they're prone to inversion injuries, then if you give some lateral wedges here, you can help to tip the feet back again. And our colleagues in Australia, Josh Burns, so he did a study with 19 people with CMT1A and pes cavus, and found that there were improvements with custom-made insoles in foot pain and foot function. And then there's ankle foot orthoses. So there's many different types of AFOs out there. And they're often used for controlling foot drops. So some of the simple devices like this that just pick up the foot. And then you can have more rigid devices for controlling the tibia in the way that we were looking at earlier, where there's plantar flexor weakness. Some of them are custom made, some of them are off the shelf. They could be very flexible or they could be very rigid. And the problem we have with the evidence is there's lots of small studies, but they're uncontrolled. They have very different materials and constructions. So actually, our colleagues in Sydney came up with this algorithm in children with CMT. So actually, maybe what we should be doing is thinking less about the individual devices, but more about what is the need of the person. Do they have foot drop and poor walking? Well, then this person may need a posterior leaf AFO. Do they have global weakness? They may need a solid AFO. So this sort of algorithm may actually be a useful next step in orthotics research. So just to summarise, we can see that exercise can be helpful. There's now moderate evidence for strength training, and more needs to be done with aerobic training. But actually what often happens is that people stop exercising after these trials. So actually do we now need to look at behaviour change? We need some larger studies of balance interventions and hand function, and perhaps need to look at optimal orthotic description in adults. Thank you very much for your attention.